I'm here today with Laura Mariko Cheifetz. She serves as Assistant Dean of Admissions, Vocation, Stewardship at Vanderbilt Divinity School. She's an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, a graduate of North Park University, McCormick Theological Seminary, and Western Washington University. But the real reason why I'm speaking with her today is that she's co-author of a book that is actually being released today. It's called Race in America, Christians Respond to the Crisis. She's a contributing editor to Inheritance, a magazine amplifying the stories of Asian American and Pacific Islander Christian faith. She is the co-author and editor of Church on Purpose, Reinventing Discipleship, Community, and Justice, and contributor to Leading Wisdom, Asian North American Women Leaders, also to Here I Am, Faith Stories of Korean American Clergywomen, and also Streams Run Uphill, Conversations with Young Clergy and Women of Color. She's the co-author of the Forming Asian Leaders for North American Churches, Entry into the Religious Leadership Reference Handbook, an occasional contributor to various blogs. Her piece called Race Gives Me Poetry, written for Unbound, an interactive journal of Christian social justice, won an Associated Church Press Award of Excellence. So Laura, it's so wonderful to have you join us, and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
Well, so great to be able to work together with you, and have so many different partners there at Vanderbilt Divinity School over the years that have worked with you all. So I really am glad to be able to do that again. So before we get into the new book, could you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you got to this point?
Sure, yeah. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, as one might expect, as I work at Vanderbilt, but I originally am from the West Coast, or the Best Coast. So I was born in California. My parents are both East Bay kids, San Francisco East Bay, and then grew up in rural Eastern Oregon and in Western Washington. So that's where that originally formed my experience and understanding of the world. I always thought that bodies of water went to other countries. That was normal for me. And then I spent a year in New York at the Presbyterian United Nations office as an intern and did a lot around racial and gender justice. And I think that really helped form a lot of who I am and how I approach things. And then I was in Chicago for school and work. And I've been in Atlanta and in Louisville and now in Nashville.
Wow. So you've gotten to taste a lot of different portions of the country.
A lot of different things. I originally wanted to go into parish ministry. When I went to seminary, I was like, this is what I really want to do. I think of the congregation as like really a locus for being able to change the world. It's such a great organizing unit. But it turns out that I'm really, really good at big systems and being able to network with a lot of people at once. And I'm really committed to how we form leaders, give them the tools that they need and help them become more of who they're meant to be in order to make change that way. So that's why I'm here doing this.
Very cool. Well, I'm very glad that you are. Very glad that you found your vocation, as they say.
Yeah.
So tell us about the previous books that you've contributed to or authored.
Yeah. So my mom is Japanese American. My dad is white Jewish. And so I identify as Asian American, which of Japanese and white Jewish descent, which is a political identity. So that has shaped a lot of what I've written. I also, in my first job / call out of seminary, was working with Asian American young adults and pastors on vocational discernment and leadership development. And I was in that world quite a bit. It's fairly extensive, but also once you know people, you know a lot of people in that world. And so I was able to then contribute to these volumes on Asian American leadership. And that I think was really fun because it's a way to be a part of my community and to help out future generations of my community. We're pretty diverse, and one of the diversities I realized I was bringing, I was accustomed to having a mom that did not have an accent, but most people who are Asian American are actually born in another country. So I realized like, oh, that's actually a little bit of diversity to come from pre-1965 migrants. My family came in the early 1900s. And so be able to bring that racial identity formation to the conversation has been really important to me, to expand the definition of what it is to be Asian American and to think about how we experience our faith. And I've also always been really interested in the way that church is that locus for change and transformation in society. I think oftentimes when people think of me, they hear me saying very critical words about how the way that the church has shaped society. It's not great, you know what, with our colonialism and doctrines of domination. But it's because I'm ultimately really hopeful about what we're able to do as church people. So that contributed to my work with Church on Purpose and to some of these other volumes as well.
Well, it's really great that, you've been able to utilize your skills and your background and your network, in some very useful ways for people. So this new book that I mentioned is just coming out today, Race in America, Christians Respond to the Crisis, was actually originally published under a different title in 2016. So can you tell us the story of how that book came about initially and how it came to be republished today?
Yeah, so it actually started in 2008 as a series of studies. It was a study pack by the Thoughtful Christian. So my co-editor, David Maxwell, he was editor for the Thoughtful Christian studies. And he was like, this is really important series of topics that we could put under racism. And he got a group of folks together to brainstorm what that could look like at McCormick Theological Seminary. Both my spouse and I worked there at the time. She was a co-author on some of the studies. So we and several other folks that he knew all contributed to this racism study pack that was really pretty popular. So it was meant to be used in, for instance, Sunday school settings with older youth and adults. And so it's meant to be very user-friendly. All of the initial study material was written by folks like us and then actual Christian educators, because not all of us are Christian educator types, came in and then wrote like the leader guides and like the curricular stuff that went along with it. And then because things happened and continued to advance and the way that race and racism was playing out in the US was shifting, he edited then a book called Race in Post-Obama America, where I think there were some folks, not necessarily me, but some folks who thought we were in such a different place because we could have a Black president, but then started to see the shadow side of that and what that brought out in society and problems we kept on having, like with immigration and all of that under the Obama administration. So then he updated it and put it together into a book that was also right around the time that Black Lives Matter was developing. And so even though not all of the older material, when you updated it, didn't necessarily include that. So he included some additional material. And then obviously the Trump era put a lot of fresh material out there around race and racism and white supremacy, and our national dialogue really developed in part because of ongoing Black Lives Matter movement and all of the stuff around immigration under the Trump administration, and because it was no longer impolite, or people didn't care that it was impolite to say or do or enact policies that the Trump era brought to us or revived. So then Bob Ratcliffe, who works at WJK, asked me if I'd be willing to work on a revision of the book and then serve as co-editor with David. So that's when we thought, like, what are the new things that we need to talk about? Obviously, a whole chapter on Black Lives Matter. I mean, it can't even begin to encompass it, but in order to keep this a very accessible book for congregations, especially and church people in general, wanting to bring that in, wanting to talk specifically about colonialism, needing to add a whole chapter to the history part on Trumpism. And I went back and revised the other history stuff because then suddenly the confirmation hearings for Sonia Sotomayor, which were brought out a lot around gender and race, seemed to pale in comparison with some of the Trump era policies and rhetoric. So just updated it for folks because it seemed like so many people are really struggling with what it says about our country and what it says about Christianity, particularly predominantly white Christian denominations, with the era of Trump and how people have voted and how divided we have become. So it seemed like a good time to keep the conversation going.
No, that's for sure. I mean, there's no question about that. Unfortunately, as you said, I mean, the racial issues with our country have just gotten worse and more pointed, I guess. And I'm glad to see that, this is a very practical book, not just a theoretical, abstract, someone's opinion kind of a thing. It's actually intended for a group and individual study, but for churches to use. And so I always am very much a proponent of what do we do about it? When we recognize a problem, what do we do about it? And so I'm glad to see you all contributing to that, answering that question.
Yeah, it's nice to have a sort of a ladder approach. So, there are some people who can read the really hardcore, in-depth stuff, like I was saying on the Facebook, that most of the people who contributed to this book have read critical race theory, like that's what we do, a lot of us, but it doesn't mean that everyone is ready for that, all that like hardcore theory stuff. So being able to bring the theory in a really accessible format is important. I don't want people to feel overwhelmed. And I also like that this, I think, is a good tool in addition to a lot of the other books that are out there. And I know it can be sort of a joke for folks to say, like, what happens when someone gets murdered by the police and it's because of their race? White churches, they'll have a book club. But the thing is that like books are a pretty good accompaniment to other kinds of ways to raise people's consciousness and move them towards action. So being able to add to that bigger toolbox for folks, I think, is important.
Yes. And so there were quite a few contributors to the book. Is that correct? I mean, roughly how many different authors wrote portions?
10 or 12, maybe.
Okay.
It was quite a few. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I mean, it's nice to have a diversity of voices, for something like that too.
Mm-hmm.
And is it divided then into 12 chapters? I mean, one chapter for each of the contributors, or is it some other way that it's structured?
It's a little more of a mix. So there's a foreword and an introduction. Some significant voices were asked to contribute to that. So Otis Moss III, for instance, is one of the contributors, and Mary Jean Boatler, who she was active in the St. Louis area around the time that Michael Brown was killed and in the aftermath of that with uprisings. And then there are some chapters that were like, for instance, Jessica and I co-wrote some of them. And then, there are other folks who contributed distinct chapters, and I think people would be able to tell who contributed what, although we did try to make the voice consistent across the book so it would feel like a coherent whole rather than just a collection of different voices. Those volumes do have their place, of course, but for a kind of a study-oriented book such as this, but it is broken into 3 different parts. So the first is like, how do we understand racism? How is it developed in the U.S.? How do we talk about it, which I think can be a big hang up. I have noticed there are a lot of people who don't have a lot of practice talking about racism and white supremacy, or even just race in general. I know there are people who say, like, even talking about difference, it's the colorblind ideology, even talking about difference is divisive. So giving people some basic understandings of definitions and all of that. There will be some readers of this book that really don't need that, but it can provide an excellent shared vocabulary, especially for study groups. And then there's several chapters on racism, what it looks like today. So Black Lives Matter and colonialism and social media, which is one of the new chapters, since that's the internet's big thing around racism, white supremacy, that I don't think had fully factored into the first volume. And I think it's become much clearer now after Trumpism, or in the midst of Trumpism, probably. And then there's a section on what to do that gives some more conversation, especially for white people, around whiteness, and then what maybe the church can do.
Very cool. Well, I like that structure and that kind of that progression of, working the issue.
Mm-hmm.
So Laura, you mentioned that there's some new portions to the book that didn't exist in the earlier version. Can you talk a little bit about those sections?
Yeah, so in the contemporary issues section, obviously there's a lot that's contemporary that maybe was not raised up in the first edition of the book, that I think are hyper pertinent, especially in the wake of Trumpism and how we're moving forward. And I think were probably pertinent before, but maybe just not as in our faces as they are now. So one of them is on colonialism and immigration. And Amaury Tañón Santos wrote that one. He's from Puerto Rico, so a colonial project of the US and before that of Spain. And being able to think about how our attitudes towards colonial subjects, I think not everyone is very clear on the relationship of Puerto Rico to the US, but people who are Puerto Rican are some of the most political people I know, because that's their survival, and they're in a very precarious position. At any point, they could lose their status by an act of Congress, regardless of what they want or what they think. Because that's how they got their status, regardless of what they wanted or what they thought.
Really?
Yeah. So being able to talk about that and how that also relates to all of the stuff on the border. So I think what happened during the Trump era in terms of now there are all of these camps across the border because people were no longer allowed to seek asylum. And that related also to the Muslim ban that then the Supreme Court held up, which is horrifying, actually speaking against a case that was about Japanese American internment. It was a very odd decision, but that's what they made. And being able to think about how our xenophobia is absolutely about race in this country in particular. It's we're not the only ones to treat it that way, but we seem to really do it with fervor. Another new chapter is on police brutality and Black Lives Matter, which I think when this first came out, it seemed like it was a thing for sure, but I'm not clear that we had a really clear understanding of how long the work would be, how the movement has really blossomed and developed and built coalitions and remained with like local control with local organizers, which I think is amazing, right? It's not gone full corporate or anything like that. And that the need for it is still dire. So being able to bring in someone to write about that is Kimberly Jackson. So she's an Episcopal priest. She's also now a state senator in Georgia. And she was present in Ferguson and a lot of the other movements early on in Black Lives Matter, and also has just a really great understanding of movement in general. And so was able to bring that lens, which I think is really important. That's the only chapter where the first person pronoun is used, the I, because she was talking about her experience, her firsthand experience, and that seemed appropriate for that chapter. Yeah. So I talked a little bit about social media and the internet, online being a way that racism and white supremacy have really developed in this country. The ways in which, for instance, groups like the Proud Boys and other white supremacist and misogynistic and xenophobic groups have been able to organize. But honestly, there's been a ton of great organizing as well by folks who are doing anti-racist work and people who are really trying to make our dialogue a little bit healthier. And so Tuhina Verma Rosh, who's a Lutheran pastor and has done some digital organizing, and she wrote a really great chapter that I think was not overly specific. Like there was not discussion about QAnon specifically, but was able to talk about kind of the broader changes that we've seen with social media and just how all of the algorithms work. I think we're probably still teasing out the impact of Facebook, for instance, and their for-profit model on our country. So she pointed to some of that research that's been coming out and how churches might need to know that.
Yes, yes. Well, you've really touched on some incredibly important and recent issues. So I'm really glad that all of that was included in this book.
Yeah, I think, again, it might be too introductory for people who read a lot of things about this already, and it might feel challenging for folks who've not really read much about this already. So I think, again, it's a good conversation starter for folks who maybe really need to have this conversation.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you for your work on it. Again, the name of the book is Race in America, Christians Respond to the Crisis. Laura, it was really wonderful to have you join us to tell us about this important new book. And thank you for that and all the other work that you do.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to talk with you about it.
Thanks very much, Laura.